Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'm going to be doing my 10 favourite Chick Corea albums. Chick Corea sadly died earlier this year. I think when that happened, a lot of musicians suddenly became aware of what a monster he was. I certainly did. I did a video on the 4 titans of music, the 4 musicians that really influenced me, which would be John McLaughlin, Frank Zappa, Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and this channel is sort of built around those musicians in a way. When Chick Corea died, I thought, Chick's the same. He's been there all this time for me. Massively influential. All these musicians that I absolutely love came through him, like Lenny White and Al Di Meola and Bill Connors and Stanley Clarke, and Dave Weckl and John Patitucci, So Chick's his own world, and it's an incredible world. He's such a virtuoso musician, such an incredible composer. And I think one of the reasons that he doesn't quite get thought of in the same as a Miles Davis or Coltrane is, I think, because he's so great and his music is so accessible. Even though in reality his music is very difficult, it's so accessible because his approach was so concise and accurate. And that's something that came out when he died, with a lot of interviews with musicians that spoke about him. And he's sort of... his approach was, how do you go about improvising? What do you do? So play some notes on the piano and ask yourself, do you like those notes? And if you like them, then play those notes. And if you don't. And I think that approach that, of owning what you do and taking responsibility for it as well, meant his music there was never a wasted note, especially from Chick. There was never a wasted note ever in his career, in Chick Corea's career. So yeah, sadly missed, absolutely incredible musician. So I've come out with 10 albums that are my favourite albums, but they also represent different aspects of his career. I've really tried to focus on the 70s and the 80s because this is what this channel does, so there's not anything from the 90s or 2000s, and also I bought a lot of these albums when I was growing up. They're really influential for me, which is in the 80s and the 90s, and so I nearly brought some of the new albums, and I thought there's so many. I thought I'm opening up such a massive world because he's made so many albums. So what I've got is 10 albums which sort of cover his career for the first 20 years or so of what he did. And go into different aspects. So the first album I got at number 10 is Echoes of an Era, which features Chick with Chaka Khan on vocals, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Joe Hens on tenor sax, Stanley Clarke on acoustic bass, and Lenny Watt on drums. What this is an album of jazz standards sung by Chaka Khan and played basically by Return to Forever, but instead of Al Di Meola, you've got Joe Hens and Freddie Hubbard. Right, so if you want to hear Chaka Khan play jazz standards, that's going to be interesting, which he does incredibly. But this is hearing what Chick basically is, and it's an incredible jazz musician. So I wanted to go, if you want to hear him play some jazz standards, and he's not taking those jazz standards out and being avant-garde or taking it anywhere, just playing straight down the line jazz. This is an incredible album with some incredible players, brilliantly recorded. So that's what my number 10 is, Echoes of an Era. Right. Chick Corea is born in 1941, right? He sort of emerges in the mid-60s with incredible virtuoso style, which mixes sort of Bud Powell, Bill Evans, with sort of Latin influences, Spanish influences, and free jazz influences. He's a pretty free player in the early days and quite an experimental player. And he joins Miles' band, which I think is where it really propels him to stardom. And he really pushes that group when he's into it towards free jazz. And when he leaves, he does a number of free jazz projects. The most famous probably being Circle, and I love these albums. There's an album called Song for Singing there. And I wanted to represent the free jazz side of him. So I pulled out this album, ARC, with David Holland and Barry Altschul. It's free, but it's beautifully recorded, and it's an easy album to get into. It is a pretty heavy album, but it's a great album. by Chick, and it really shows you that sort of avant-garde free side. I think if you want to get into free jazz, Chick's a really good place to start, because Chick never wastes a note. Everything he plays is logical, and so you can hear the logic of what he's doing and how that plays out across the band. You know, a lot of the free groups at this time, they're really experimenting with sound, and they're really seeing how sound mingles together. You know, Barry Altschul was playing drums on here. I think the amount of rehearsing they must have done to integrate his drum sound into the ways that Dave Hollid and Chick Corea are improvising, that is where the work is, and that is a way in for these albums, to see how they sonically integrate the little worlds that they create, and then how they respond in these slightly different worlds to a normal jazz trio. So yeah, ARC, Chick Corea, great album. Around this time, in the early 70s, he does 2 solo piano improvised albums for ECM, predating Keith Jarrett doing a similar thing. I find Chick's albums far more interesting than Keith Jarrett's solo piano albums, which I love. You know, I really do love them. But Chick is just does so much, you know, in that solo piano context. And of the 2 piano improvisation albums, I feel he does a little bit more on volume 2. He pushes the boat out on this one, Chick Corea volume 2. So if you want to even play piano, right, there's such virtuoso playing where he sounds like a machine on here. You know, there's some beautiful impressionistic stuff. On side 2, there's a track called Departure from Planet Earth, which is a solo jazz piano improvisation, but it does sound like somebody departing planet Earth. It's quite incredible. The vision that someone can have on the instrument. I read a review of this when I was a kid, which is why I bought it, which said it sounds like someone turning a tape recorder on in somebody's mind, and that gives you an idea. So these 2 early albums, they're difficult albums. I've got a lot of albums from this period. It could have been other ones, but I thought I should represent that. I think Chick Corea realised, I think around the time he becomes a Scientologist, he wants to become more accessible to audiences. So he stops all the free jazz and he forms a band called Return to Forever in the early 70s. And then the music takes on a more commercial aspect. And Chick Corea's been very successful in really dipping into avant-garde jazz and then moving right out to commercial jazz and really making a statement which redefines the genre. He did that with the Latin jazz Return to Forever, then he did that with the electric Return to Forever. In the early 80s, he spent a lot of the time on ECM doing some quite, you know, like orchestral-y stuff, string quartet stuff, some free improvisation stuff, and then suddenly in 1986 he came out with the electric band, and I brought this here, which is at number, well, how many have I done? So that's 10, 9, 8. So at number 7, I've got the first Chick Corea electric band album, which really is one of those albums from the 80s that really defined 80s electric jazz. I'm going to do a video on 80s fusion or electric jazz, and this will be a definitely very important album in there to creating that sound. I think this is a brilliant album, and I think he's fantastic on it. The electric band albums, they go off on all the different places, and they do some really interesting stuff, you know, some real commercial stuff, which is like on the second album, and then some really sort of almost like fusion version of Bartok, you know, really heavy, almost like prog stuff. But I think they really define the sound on the first album, so that's worth checking out. So that was at number 10, 9, 8, 7. So at number 6, right, I brought this one in, which is one of my favourite Chick Corea albums. I thought I should put it in. Touchstone. There it is. Touchstone, which is... There's a whole bunch of albums that really explores Spanish side. I could have easily have put in My Spanish Heart that's up there in the background. But I really love this album. The lineup is absolutely incredible. It's got Stanley Clarke on it, Gail Moran's on it, Lee Konitz on it, Carlos Benavet on bass, who's brilliant. Lordia de Livia is on here, Steve Kajula on flute, Paco de Lucia, Lenny White, Al Vizzuti, Don Alias, Alex Acuna and Aldo Meola. There's one track called Compadres, which is basically a return to forever, reformation for this one track, So if you're into Return to Forever and you haven't got this one, you're missing out on a Return to Forever track. But there's a lot of sort of impressionistic stuff. There's a lot of real Spanishy stuff on here. And there's some incredible fusion stuff. Really great playing. His compositions are fantastic. I really love that album. I thought I should put that in there. Right, at number 6. At number 5, I have got this one. Friends. This cover's quite famous. I will hold it there for a while. Some people hate this cover. I don't hate it. I like the Smurfs. I don't think it represents the music that's on here. It looks like you're going to get something. I think of my kids, when they were like 5, would probably go, "Oh, Dad, put this album on. It looks brilliant." And what would they get? They would get some really heavy jazz with a fusion influence, but almost quite straight ahead. The lineup is Chick Corea, Joe Farrell, Steve Gadd, and Eddie Gomez. Gadd is off the scale. It's one of Gadd's great moments. This is a great, swinging, well-produced jazz album with fusion influences. It's not 100% fusion. And I love this album. It's absolutely fantastic. All right. So, at which would be number 4, is my chart of favourite Chick Corea albums. I've got this one, Trio Music. Chick Corea, Miroslav Vitous and Roy Haynes. This is a double album. All right. Here you go. Let's see it. Look at that. It's nice to see inside these albums. There they are. Beautifully recorded. It's on ECM, of course. It's beautifully recorded. The second disc is actually him playing the music of Thelonious Monk, which he plays absolutely brilliantly. The rhythm section of Roy Haynes and Miroslav Vitous is just utterly incredible, and their reaction time to what Chick's doing and what everyone else is doing is incredible. But if you want to hear him play the music of Thelonious Monk, which he's very suited to playing, it's an influence in there. He doesn't always go down there, but it's interesting to hear him play the Monk stuff. This is jazz. I wanted to put a jazz trio album in because I think some of the great jazz trio albums of piano, bass and drums, a lot of them are Chick Corea albums. I think his very first album is one of the great jazz trio albums, but I went for this one instead because of the fact that you've got 2 discs, and the first one is in playing Thelonious Monk, but the second disc is Thelonious Monk. The first disc here is the one that really gets me, which is called Trio Improvisations, and it's completely improvised music. 3 trio improvisations, and a duet improvisation, and then a trio improvisation, 2 of those, and then a track called Slippery When Wet, which sounds like a sort of 8-bar form, but really sketched out. The rest of it is entirely improvised. I wouldn't call it free improvisation. It's highly organised. This, if I'm dealing with students and want to explain what improvisation is, and especially free improvisation, I would play them this. What they're doing is so logical. The reaction time is so quick. They pick up on ideas so quickly and form them into finished piece of music. This is really, truly one of Chick's great albums. At number 4? Right, number 3, I have this monster. I've covered it before on this channel. 3 quartets by Chick Corea. It's just incredible. The lineup's just mind-blowing, which is Eddie Gomez, Michael Brecker, Chick Corea, Steve Gadd. I did a video on Michael Brecker, and I said his solo on the first quartet, which is called Quartet Number 1. He's one of the greatest solos ever in the history of all solos. It's absolutely incredible. And part 2, there's a whole track on side 2 called Quartet Number 2, which has got part 1 and part 2, and then part 2 is dedicated to John Coltrane, and it's got one of Steve Gadd's greatest drum solos and one of the greatest drum solos of all time. This album's beautifully recorded. The playing is utterly sublime. It's incredible jazz improvisation, which at some points is very free in a sort of Coltrane way, that sort of Coltrane quartet way, and it's sometimes very composed and organised. It's an absolutely incredible album. At number 3. At number 2, right, I thought I'm going to pick one album to represent all of Return Forever, because I think, I could have easily have put 4 of the Return to Forever albums in here. Return to Forever is such an important band for me. If I just quickly go through the Return to Forever albums, I think the first one on ECM is a bit noodly for me. It's a great album, a little bit noodly. The second album is much stronger, and there's some incredible compositions on there. I really love that. And then they go electric, and they pull in, Lenny White, Stanley Clarke, and they pull in Bill Connors. And Hymn to the Seventh Galaxy is one of the greatest fusion albums. It's in my top 10 fusion albums, and it hasn't made the list, but it's in my top 10 fusion albums ever. It's one of the great fusion albums ever. And that's followed up by Where Have I Known You Before, which is not far off being as good as Hymn to the Seventh Galaxy. That's followed up by No Mystery, which I felt is a little bit of a drop. That suffers from a little bit of a funk disco overload every now and then. It's still incredible, and I love the acoustic track No Mystery. That's beautiful. And then that's followed up with my number 2 album, which is this. Romantic Warrior. I don't know how many times I've had this on this channel now. It keeps cropping up. I think it's because it just sits between prog and fusion and jazz and all my favourite players. But that's my number 2. And then after that they did Music Magic, and I think there's a live Return to Forever, and those 2 albums are with a much bigger band. So of all the Return to Forever albums, this one's my favourite. Hymn to the Seventh Galaxy is like that far off, being my favourite as well, and I think next time I might put that one in. But yeah, you've got to get this album. It's just one of the great fusion albums ever. So at number 1 is this album, and I've talked about it before, Chick Corea, Leprechaun. This just stands alone for me because it's bonkers. It's just the most bonkers album you'll ever hear. It's like a sort of jazz fusion prog conceptual album about fairies. Right? So it starts off with the Imp's Welcome, and then it's got a little note. The Imp is the Leprechaun's herald. He summons you and welcomes you to his world. Right, then it goes into a track called Lenore, which is a beautiful track, absolutely incredible. And it's a vocal track, and it's got incredible drumming from Steve Gadd. It's very light and airy, and it says, the Leprechaun plays the dance for his fairy queen. This is bonkers. And I'm telling you this, you probably think, what the hell is this? But musically, it's just mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing. And side 2 ends up with the Leprechaun's Dream, and it's just some of the heaviest playing you'll ever hear in your life. I love Chick Corea when he plays Fender Rhodes, and he plays a ton of Fender Rhodes on here. And I think that is great. I love him with Steve Gadd. And I love his compositions, and his compositions are really strong in here. I've spoken about Night Sprite on here, which is one of the great, I think it must have been in my top 10 drum tracks, probably at number 2 or 3, because it is one of the great drum tracks of all time. That's my number 1 from Chick Corea. What a musician. I want to end with a story that Frank Gambale told after he died. They had a chat about working with him, and I think it sums up what made Chick Corea so great. And he said he'd recorded a solo on one of the Electric Band albums, and he loved the solo. He nailed it, but right at the end he'd hit a couple of notes, fluffed a couple of notes, and he wasn't happy with it. So he went into Chick and he said, Chick, can I just drop in and change a couple of notes at the end of that solo? And Chick Corea turned around and says, nope. And Frank's go, well, why? And he goes, don't you like those notes? And Frank went no. And Chick goes, well, why'd you play them then? And I think that sums up the genius that Chick Corea was. That he had got to such a level, he was so in control of what he was doing instrumentally. I can remember listening to an interview once, and he was talking about a jazz trumpeter and how much he loved his playing. And the interviewer said, was he a big influence? He said, yes. He says, when I was very young, I transcribed his solos because I thought they were really interesting. And they said, oh, and so what did you do? Play them on piano? He went, oh no, I transcribed them and played them on trumpet. I remember hearing that and thinking, oh my God, this guy was something else. He really was something else. but he was so open and light, and everything was so relaxed and made everything sound so easy that I don't think people really realised how truly heavy this guy was, and how he was one of the great jazz musicians of all time. Anyway, that's my top 10 Chick Corea. So glad to have got this one down, because I knew I was missing talking about Chick, and ever since he died I wanted to do that. If you like these videos and you like me chatting about these things I'm chatting about, you know, put a like in the like, put a subscribe, but most importantly, put something in the comments. We have some great conversations, and you know, I think when people come up and, you know, watch these videos in the future and they can see these great conversations and all the other albums that everyone suggested, I think it's becoming a great resource for any of us that loves, you know, jazz fusion and prog and rock from the 70s and 80s and all that classic stuff. So yeah, you know, again, really appreciate it. I've got a little audience here which is growing by the day, and it's great, you know, so really enjoying doing this. I'm going to keep on doing it for a while, as long as people are liking the videos and, you know, putting in the comments, I will. So yeah, I'm babbling on, but I will see you soon, all of you, very soon. Goodbye.